Wow, I don't know if I feel like just sitting back down after that introduction, because I'm sure this is going to live up to all that. It's much appreciated. And I really am grateful for having had the chance to work with people like Joyelle and all the other writers here, and especially the people that come into our program, and this reading is sort of for them. Mainly because I'm going to read from Once Human Stories, which brings together a number of stories grouped together around this idea of end times, especially in regards to humans, and especially in regards to the sciences and technologies that we think we can use to understand ourselves. Originally was planning on reading a story with a robot in it.
Yeah.
But, yeah, right. But since there's so many authors here today, I thought I'd read a story with an author in it instead. Yeah, I can hear the sigh, the robots versus authors. Who's going to win that one, right? But anyway, the story's called Farewell to Kilimanjaro, which, like its title says, it's sort of a mashup of a lot of Hemingway stories. So it's about writing, it's about authors, it's about why we do what we do. It's about that Hemingway moment, which was really important when I was starting out as a writer. This time when people still thought of literature in terms of genius and originality and art heroism and all that sort of stuff. And it's also about another very modernist idea, which is the idea that every generation sweeps away the literature that came before it. And that's why I would like to dedicate it to all of the young authors out here in the room tonight, except for there's one line near the end I want to dedicate to Laura Walls, actually. You'll see towards the end of the story, they go through this literary flyover over the country. So it's like a reverse flash forward of all of literary history in America. It happens quickly, and there'll be no test at the end. But there's a line in there I think you'll recognize, Laura. Get to it, so it's for you. Okay, the story's almost novella length, and I've edited it down to fit the time that we have. So it'll be about 40 minutes, so get comfortable. Okay, it begins with an epigram. Okay with the sound, everybody? Kilimanjaro is a snow-covered mountain and is said to be the highest mountain in Africa. Its western summit is called the Masai Ngje Ngi, the House of God. Close to the western summit, there is a frozen carcass of a leopard. No one has explained what the leopard was seeking at that altitude. Farewell to Kilimanjaro. Late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. In the bed of the river, there were pebbles and boulders, dry and white in the sun, and the water was clear and swiftly moving and blew into channels. Troops went by the house and down the road, and the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees. The trunks of the trees, too, were dusty, and the leaves fell early that year, and we saw the troops marching along the road, and the dust rising and leaves stirred by the breeze falling, and the soldiers marching, and afterward the road bare, and we said goodbye to white hair forever with Grecian Formula 409, blared a commercial 10 times louder than the volume of the show, and E swore bitterly at having been brought back to it by the day room he had been wheeled into. For the sunshine, the nursing aide had nattered, turning his wheelchair to position him before the television. E's colostomy gurgled as he turned to look out the window. In the sunshine outside, a mimosa tree shaded their sign. Kilimanjaro Arms for the Aged, Inc., a wholly owned subsidiary of Time Warner. Did the wide world really continue on out there without him? It was hard to believe so, judging from this view. Just past the sign was the swish of traffic on Route 66, and just beyond that a strip mall. In the heat of its parking lot, vultures squat obscenely, while in the sky a dozen more sailed, making quick-moving shadows on the motionless cars. Look at them, he said. Now is it the sight of this place or its stink that brings them like that? No one answered. A Parkinson's case continued to stare mask-like in the general direction of the television while nursing aides went about their routines. A radio played. To no one in particular, E continued. I watched the way they sailed very carefully at first, in case I ever wanted to use them in a story. That's funny, now. On TV, picture-in-picture displayed a still of an anorexial skeletal woman in the corner of the main screen, which displayed live video of her obese version. Judging from this, the only other view that he had, the view from the 19-inch keyhole, E doubted he would recognize the world outside the home, even if he could get back in it. Binge and purge eating became my life, said the talk show guest on TV. He tried to escape. He tried to get back to his first war, the war he had had when he was young instead of this war that he now had, and in his head he wrote, there were many victories. The mountain beyond the valley was captured, as were mountains. Mountains of ice cream, mountains of chocolate. There was not a feeling of a storm coming. And you felt trapped? The host asked, holding his guest's hand. You always feel trapped biologically, he answered. Eating made me feel inadequate, but hunger made me see truly how Cézanne made landscapes. Suddenly he realized he had not only skipped 100 pages, but had derailed into an entirely different book. You goddamn complainer, he shouted, blaming those on the screen. The guest began slobbering into a handkerchief, her body shaking with great theatric sobs of self-pity. You dirty, phony saint and martyr. Should I change the channel for you? It was C, the rehab nurse, the only staffer who didn't yak away as merry mindlessly as a TV weatherman, or sulk about her duties with the concern common to minimum wage employees. I'm only talking, he said, calming himself to bring down his blood pressure. It's much easier if I talk, but I don't want to bother you. You know it doesn't bother me, she said. It's that I've gotten so very nervous not being able to do anything. I think we might make it as easy as we can until the doctors get your cancer into remission, or until they don't get my cancer into remission. Please tell me what I can do. There must be something I can do. You can take my arms off, and that might make it easier, though I doubt it. Or you can shoot me. Please don't talk that way. Couldn't I read to you? Read what? Anything in the book bag that we haven't yet read. I can't listen to it, he said. There hasn't been pure artistry since that damn classical conductor Stokowski stooped to shake hands with Mickey Mouse in Fantasia. Talking is the easiest. The next day, the guests on the talk show had taken to quarreling among themselves. I'll tell you this, a GI shouted at the artist who had made a life-size church out of garbage. In my parish, you're a dog. The audience howled. We quarrel and that makes the time pass. I don't quarrel, C said. I never want to quarrel. Let's not quarrel anymore. No matter how nervous we get, maybe your next treatment will be the one. Your oncologist told me that any one treatment could be the one that puts your cancer into remission. Don't be silly. I'm dying now. Ask those bastards. He looked over to the huge, filthy birds, now sitting on the sign and looking in, their naked heads sunk in the hunched feathers. Transvestites in the modeling industry. More at 10. Ooh-wee, Uncle Jed. When I caught my boyfriend doing it with my mother in front of our mirror, wept the guest, disguised for anonymity as Groucho Marx, I thought I would lose my mind. If it bothers you so much, E remembered telling F, why do you want to talk about it? Watching this nation of whiners, he still didn't know. But even more perplexing was the unconditional victory of open wounds on camera over grace under pressure. It wasn't that he couldn't have gone public with his own chronic depression, or his impotence, or the suffering he endured as a minority in the Italian army. After everything he'd lived through, being machine gunned, blown up, shipwrecked with Ginger and the others, 3 divorces, burnt by hot water twice, clawed by a lion, gored by bulls, gored by feminists, dysentery twice, pneumonia pulling a skylight down on his head, 2 plane crashes in Africa, marooned on an uncharted planet. Or wait, did that happen in Lost in Space? He couldn't be sure anymore, but what's more, he couldn't care. Battles, executions, tortures, violations, fearful customs, unbelievable practices, but through it all, a stiff upper lip. That stiff lip contained the only real meaning in a godless, modernist universe, after all, and a man would make it show up in his art. He calmed himself to remember reading his own work in a steady voice. A big shell came in and burst outside in the brickyard. Another burst, and in the noise you could hear the smaller noise of the brick and dirt raining down. Lieutenant Henry asked, "What is there to eat?" What is there to eat? Dread gripped E. Had he remembered to tick the dessert box on today's menu? What I leave out is as important as what I put in, he'd once told that pony boy from the Paris Review, and the irony depressed him greatly. He'd been leaving out more and more lately, and not just in terms of art. Sighing, he resigned himself to missing out on today's fruit cup, the one thing with any flavor on his institutional diet. What about a drink? It's bad for you. Your oncologist said to avoid all alcohol. Molo, he shouted. Yes, buana, answered an orderly. Bring whiskey soda. Yes, buana. You shouldn't, C said. That's what I mean by giving up. Your oncologist says it's bad for you. I know it's bad for you. You should play shuffleboard instead. I'll push you out to the court. No, he said. Then he sulked. So now it was all over, he thought. So this was the way it ended, in a bickering over shuffleboard. Since the cancer had spread, he had no pain, and with the pain, the horror had gone, and all he felt now was a great tiredness and anger, for this was the end of it. For this, that now was coming, he had very little curiosity. For years, through all his treatments, through scares of the nation's blood supply being tainted with AIDS, through reports of Tylenol and a host of other consumables being laced with cyanide, through anxiety created by red dye number 12, radon, and new sources of cancer, through lethal space heaters, high chairs, autos, and their factory recalls, through upswings and random street violence, and arrest of family members who'd abandoned their senile parents at airports because they could no longer deal with the stress of the aged. Through this and more, death had obsessed him, but now it meant nothing in itself. It was strange how easy being tired of writing made it. It was strange how still wanting to write made him seem like all those other people on TV. Either way, now, he would never write the things that he had never had the time to write because of the crush of teaching freshman composition after he was too old to go on safari, and after being reviled by the universities that gave their faculty time to publish. Well, he would not have to fail at trying to write them either. Maybe he could never write them, and that was the real reason he was slowly shut out, not the shrinking departments, mergers with women's studies, or march of literary fashion. Well, he would never know now. I'm glad we're not like those horrid people, C said, nodding towards the people on TV. We are those horrid people, all of us. I'm not, you're not. You couldn't write those poetic books if you were. You couldn't love me if you were. Oh yeah, I love you, you kind, condescending bitch. That's poetry. I'm full of poetry now. Cancer in poetry. Cancerous poetry. Yes. C began to sniffle. E sulked. It was evening now, and he had been asleep. The vultures no longer waited on the sign. They were all perched heavily in the mimosa tree, their bodies silhouetted by the fluorescent glow of the strip mall across the road. If he used his imagination, he could believe that the birds weren't waiting for him, but for people coming out of the strip mall's mini-mart. His personal boy was sitting by the bed. Men Sahib's gone to Dunkin' Donuts, the boy said. Does Buana want? Nothing. She had gone to get a cream Slurpee, and knowing how the sight of them was aesthetically appalling to him, she had stayed away until she drained it all. In his mind, he could see her making that irritating sucking sound with her straw, but doing it out of his earshot. She was always thoughtful, he thought. It was not her fault that when he went to her, he was already over. How could a woman know that you meant nothing that you said, that you spoke only from habit and to be comfortable? It was not so much that he lied as that there was no truth to tell. He had had his life and it was over, and then he went on living in this place. You kept from thinking what this place was, and it was marvelous. You played along and called this place a retirement community, like they all did, and you were equipped with good insides so that you did not go to pieces that way, the way most of them had, and you made an attitude that you cared nothing for the work you used to do, now that you could no longer do it. But in yourself, you said that you would write about these people, about the aged, the terminally ill, about riders of golf carts and patrons of museum gift shops, that you were really not of them but a spy in their country, that you would leave it and write of it, and for once it would be written by someone who knew what he was writing of. But you would never do it because each day of not writing, of comfort, of being that which you despised, dulled your ability and softened your will to work, so that finally you did nothing at all, nothing except watch television. And that's how those Italians get stripes into cannoli, an anchor model chirped, standing in a cafe like the one from which E filed stories when he worked as a war correspondent for the Toronto Star. The bombardment of Plava, the evacuation of Thrace, the retreat from Coporeto, the slaughter of Somme, the slaughter of Verdun, the slaughter of Vittorio Veneto. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hello were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates. C said she loved her job, he thought, staring at a crack in the wall. She loved taking care of people, seeing them through therapy, reteaching old hands to squeeze rubber balls. And he had felt the illusion of returning strength of will to work. Now, if this was how it ended, and he knew it was, he must not turn like some snake biting itself because its back was broken. Then he saw her, walking across the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot with a Slurpee cup in her hand, a big gulp 42-ouncer. She was still a good-looking woman, he thought, and as she stood waiting to cross Route 66, a carload of male silhouettes slowed to also look. The more things changed, the more cigarettes glowed inside the car. She hurried across just as the punk screeched off, leaving her in a wake of hoots and wolf whistles at her body, still handsome enough to fool teenagers, even though in a few years she would probably be a resident instead of an employee of the home. She had a great talent and appreciation for the bed, he considered, as she approached their front porch. She was not pretty, but he liked her face, wrinkles and all. She read enormously. Her husband had died when she could still call herself middle-aged, and for a while she lived being shuttered between her grown children, who did not need her and were embarrassed at having her about. Then one of her 2 children was murdered for being a rich, though naive, tourist on vacation in a picturesque, though dirt poor and politically turbulent, country. It's the parenthetical elements that always get you. And the inattention of her remaining son was no anesthetic, and she was suddenly acutely frightened of being alone. She devoted herself to this place that needed her so badly. It had begun very simply. She liked what he wrote, and he liked what she read. She brought better booze to the home than he could buy from the commissary. Then she began reading to him. With the door to his room closed, a bottle of bourbon besides the water glass that held his dentures. The steps by which she had acquired him and the way in which she had finally fallen in love with him were all part of a regular progression in which she had built herself a new life, and he had traded away what remained of his old life. He had traded it for security, for comfort too, there was no denying that, and for what else? He did not know. She was a damn nice woman. He knew that. He would as soon be in bed with her as anyone, rather with her, because she was closer to his age and understood how it was. And now this life that she had built again was coming to a term because his body had turned against him. A cancer that began in his colon, spawning like trout in his bloodstream. Here she came now. He turned his head on his hospital bed to look at her. "Hello," he said. "I bought you a Mick croissant," she said, taking it from a bag. "I thought it might remind you of Paris. I got the kind without sesame seeds that upset your intestinal tract. Do you feel well enough to eat it?" He nodded. "I had a good sleep. Did you walk far?" She tore cellophane away from plastic utensils, then cut the Mick croissant into proportions fitting for the very old or the very young. "All the way to KFC. Kmart was having a sidewalk sale." She pulled from her bag a pinwheel, blew on it to make it spin, then handed it to him, laughing. "Oh, you don't know how I would like a KFC Cajun style," he said, wishing he could gather enough breath to spin the pinwheel himself. It stuck from his meaty fist like a flower that had rigor mortis. "When you're well enough to eat spicy food, we'll celebrate by sharing a thigh. Darling, you don't know how marvelous it is to see you feeling better." From her blouse, she took 2 pairs of 3D glasses. They were for the Circus of Celebrities that Coca-Cola was sponsoring later that night. The glasses would make the show appear in 3D, and Coca-Cola was giving them away with any Coke product purchase. Since she didn't have any Coke products, the carbonation gave him gas, he guessed that she had used the excuse to indulge in a little recreational shoplifting. "I couldn't stand it when you felt that way. You won't talk to me like that again, will you? Promise me?" She put a pair of the glasses on his head, and he adjusted them. One lens was blue and the other red. "No," he said, looking with only the red eye. "Getting old is horrible, horrible." He switched to the blue. "You say things you don't mean and mean things you can't say." "You don't have to destroy me, do you? I'm only a senior citizen who loves you and wants to do what you want to do. I've been destroyed 2 or 3 times already. You wouldn't want to destroy me again, would you?" "I'd like to destroy you a few times in bed," he said. "Yes, that's the good destruction. That's the way we're made to be destroyed. I'm sure your Tuesday chemo treatment will put the cancer in remission." "How do you know?" "I'm sure. It's bound to come." What makes you think this Tuesday's treatment will be the one?" "I'm sure it will. It's overdue now. It'll go into remission, then you'll get stronger, and then we'll have some good destruction. Not that dreadful talking kind." Happily, she turned and called into the hall. "Molo, lette due whiskey soda." The highlight of the evening, the Circus of Celebrities came and went. Sinbad taught a monkey to smoke a cigar. Then there were the memoirs of cameramen who taught mobs of militant Iranians to chant "Death to CIA" in English so as to create a more dramatic scene for viewers and sponsors back home. Then, as Laverne and Shirley reruns passed into the Beverly Hillbillies reruns, followed by I Dream of Jeannie reruns, they drank, and just before Jay Leno, when it was dark and the mini-mart was empty except for its single employee, a hyena crossed the sidewalk on its way around the outdoor ice machine. "That bastard crosses there every night," he said, pointing. "Every night for 2 weeks. He's the one that makes that noise at night. I don't mind it. They're a filthy animal, though." Drinking together with no pain now, except the discomfort of watching reruns he'd already seen, the light of the television jumping on the ceiling, he could feel the return of acquiescence in this life of pleasant surrender. She was very good to him. He had been cruel and unjust in the afternoon. She was a fine woman, really, and just then it occurred to him that he was going to die. It came with a rush, not as a rush of water nor of wind, but of a sudden evil-smelling emptiness, and the odd thing was that the hyena slipped lightly along the edge of it. "What is it, E?" she asked him. "Nothing," he said. "You had better move over to the other side, to windward." "Did Molo empty your colostomy bag?" "Yes, he said he'll get a Q-tip and swab out the orifice with boric acid later." The moist hole in his side made a sucking noise, and the charcoal filter taped around it to remove the stench reminded him of the soldier who had plugged holes in his chest with cigarette butts before he'd gone on fighting. But he couldn't remember if that man had actually existed or simply come from an ad like the ones in which cover models were kept perpetually young and happy by the filters of their cigarettes. "Alive with pleasure!" "How do you feel?" "A little wobbly." "Well, I'm going out to the car. I forgot to hide its radio under the seat, and I heard there's been another smashing on the block. I'll be right back." "We'll be right back." Now in his mind, he saw an apartment complex in Karagech, constructed by a multinational company for materials that had been outlawed in the West and could therefore only be sold in third world countries. That was one of the things he had never had the time to write, with the children who played in the basement where the asbestos crumbled. They hit it with sticks so it would swirl around them in great blizzards as they shouted, "Snow! Snow!" Seeing them come out for air, their dark bodies of fleecy white, a UN peacekeeper had asked an old man, "Is that snow?" And the old man had answered, "It's too early for snow." And it was not snow that they rollicked in until they began wheezing that winter. Nor was it snow inside the North Orchard shopping mall, though it looked like snow, arranged about Santa's throne, from which a man who was not Santa passed out coloring books that, when painted with water, became pre-colored ads for the pre-assembled models, cha-cha beat organs that played preset songs, complete sets of collector baseball cards, and military toys from a manufacturer that had frantically reprogrammed an assembly line in China to duplicate, in time for Christmas, the snow-white camouflage used in the latest global hotspot. Nor had it been snow that the boy had been staring at during a holiday visit to the home his parents had chucked Grandpa into. The boy, naturally, was not used to seeing white hair and had innocently asked, "Mama, why do all the people here have snow on their heads?" "There might be snow on the roof," C had growled into E's ear, "but there's fire where it counts." Behind everyone's back, she grabbed his crotch. "That's us," he had answered, "the snows of Kilimanjaro." He had seen the world change, and not just the events, but the subtler changes. He could remember how people were at different times. There was so much to write. Why? "You tell them why," he said. "Why what, dear?" "Why nothing." He could beat anything, he thought, because no thing could hurt him if he did not care. All right, now he would not care for death. One thing he had always dreaded was the pain. Still, this now that he had was very easy, and if it was no worse as it went on, there was nothing to worry about. Yes, about him were vacant expressions, living skeletons, loneliness, the horror of institutional decor and Southwest color schemes, but little apparent pain. It would be nicer to be in better company, though. He thought a little about the company that he would rather have. His mother, Freddie Stemmer from 6th grade, when laughter came as easily as breath. No, he thought, when everything you do too long and do too late, you can't expect to find the people still there, nor the ideas. Men have taken to wearing earrings. Women wear tattoos. Max Perkins was gone, as was Clement Greenberg. Faulkner, Joyce, Stein, Freud, Picasso, gone. Eliot, gone. Conrad, gone. Ernst, gone. Klee, gone. Beckett isn't waiting for Godot. Trilling's gone. Pound, Rottengen's discovery of X-rays. League of Nations, Point of View as epistemological probe. Tolstoy's What is Art? Duchamp's urinal answer. High-speed tool steels, priestly art heroes, gone. Industrial aesthetics, Metropolis, orchestral portraits of locomotives, relativity, frustration of coherent plots, madmen artists, photojournalism adapted to the needs of anger, piano playing with fists, black forests of notes so dense that the score looks like black forests of notes. And it goes on. There's a prose poem that's sort of a homage to modernism that goes for multiple pages, so I'll just cut to the chase. Elitism, Wolf, Stream of Consciousness, Magic Mountain, Dreams Without Meaning, the pre-Castro Cuban cigar, Defiance before it could be used to sell t-shirts, Sweep away yesterday's literature, the avant, gone, gone, gone. All exhausted and gone, and with them the pure air. I'm getting as bored with dying as with everything else, he thought, realizing what he'd been thinking about. It's a bore, he said out loud. What is, my dear? Anything you do too bloody long. He looked at her sitting between him and the glow of the television. Its gray-blue light shone on her pleasantly lined face, and he could see that she was sleepy. The hyena made a noise just outside the window. "Do you feel anything strange?" he asked her. "No, just a little sleepy." "I do," he said. He had just felt death come by again. "Our Nada, who art in Nada, Nada be thy name. Thy kingdom Nada, thy will be Nada, in Nada as it is in Nada." He told her how just in that instant he had felt like the old man in a story he had once written. For weeks on end went the story. This old man stayed late into the night at the same cafe simply because he had nowhere else to go, and the cafe was a clean, well-lighted, and pleasant place to sit. As he spoke, a man emerged from the fluorescent white of the 24-hour Quickie Mart across the way. Styrofoam cup in hand, he got into the lot's one lone car and drove off. "Two waiters in the story," he continued, "had to wait for this old man to finish nursing his brandy before they could close up and go home. So night after night, one of the waiters, the young one, got more and more exasperated with this old man and his routine, his own life on hold, sometimes until 3 in the morning. But the other waiter, the older one, understood that if they didn't stay open for the old man, there would be nothing but nada. Nada but the antiseptic chrome of steam pressure machines used in other bars. Nada but those music-filled bars where it was impossible to stand with dignity. Nada but the old man's own empty room, which is to say, nada serving nada, when everyone needed a place in which they could be at peace. A clean, well-lighted. Suddenly, he stopped talking. Because just then, death had come and rested its head on the chrome of his bed. "Never believe any of that about a scythe and a skull," he told C. It can just as easily be 0% financing, or it can have a wide snout like a hyena. It had moved up on him now, but it had no shape anymore. It simply occupied space. Tell it to go away. It did not go away, but moved a little closer. "You've got a hell of a breath," he told it, "you stinking bastard." It moved up closer to him still, and now he could not speak to it. And when he saw he could not speak, it came a little closer, and now he tried to send it away without speaking, but it moved in on him so its weight was all upon his chest. And while it crouched there and he could not move or speak, he heard C say, "Buana is asleep now. Shut the television off." He could not speak to tell her to make it go away, and it crouched now, heavier, so he could not breathe. And then, while the light of the television went dark, suddenly it was all right, and the weight went from his chest. It was morning, and had been morning for some time when the ambulance plane came to take him to the Mayo Clinic. Doctors there had discovered a miraculous cure for his type of cancer, a microbe that when released into the bloodstream acted like a Pac-Man on any cells that weren't healthy. The plane was very sleek and modern and painted like a regular ambulance, but in the pilot's seat was old Compton, dressed like a professor in slacks, a tweed jacket, and a brown felt hat. "We'll have you there in record time, old cock," Compy called back cheerfully to where E lay, and then the engine roared. Acceleration pressed him into a stretcher. A final bump and they are in the air, with C and the others down below, waving goodbye from the enormous shuffleboard court that had served as a makeshift runway. As the plane rose, the strip mall E had gazed at for so many hours fell away. Route 66 and its traffic also became toy-sized. They flew over Paramount Studios and the studios of MTV standing in the shadow of Disney spires. From this height, he could see these assembly lines attracting to them a string of Okies similar to those Steinbeck wrote about. In jalopies and Winnebagos and Toyotas, they made their way across the mountains in search of the promised land. Yet, as he crossed onto the leeward side of the mountains, he was struck by how similar was the promised land he had left to the unpromised land into which they were flying. A plain of Taco Bells and McDonald's and Walmarts and Midas muffler shops as far as the eye could see. Its desert ground made Las Vegas, the cultural capital of America, shimmer as brilliantly as an oasis rendered in day-glow colors on black velvet. Suddenly, the plane pitched. Compy had executed a barrel roll to avoid colliding with Apollo 11, returning from its moon landing not to Earth, but to worlds. In its wake were billions of texts that weren't books, polyglot noise, and ecstasy of communication, the beginning of history as fictions and the end of literature as art. Then they passed Ketchum, Idaho, where E knew he could have taken matters into his own hands so he wouldn't have to live to see it. He wiped a tear of regret into a tear of nostalgia when the Mississippi came into view, shimmering with the country's first glimmer of the modern. A single barnstorming loopity-loop through the St. Louis Arch, and they were soaring above Middle America. E looked down to see if he could spot the home he grew up in, but they were too high, and it was lost in a patchwork that reminded him of the quilt he had once seen, made from T-shirts collected at rock concerts. Those amusement parks that proliferated during the 70s had also found a home here, the New York companies that had made them abandoning their maintenance to smaller outfits. From miles off, he spotted an influential one designed by the firm of Shandy, Watt, and Menard. The arc of its signature roller coaster, the Gravity's Rainbow, towered above many other similar rides. Even from this height, E could hear riders shrieking in terror and glee, and the first time in his life he understood the attraction of a place like that and why so many had stopped reading books like his in order to go there. Ah, well, he sighed loudly, let them have their fun. Compy looked back to see how he was riding. Then instead of banking into the direction of the Mayo Clinic, he pushed on towards the eastern horizon. He, evidently figuring a bit of a tour wouldn't hurt. Below, stockyards, cold water tenements, and crude naturalism gave way to more rural landscape. Winesburg, Compy called back, indicating a small town where, just like the houses of today, all the window shades were up. The clover leaves along the expressway that Compy was now paralleling took on the character of those patterns made by Aborigines to guide flying saucers, and near Pennsylvania, it dawned on E that what he was looking at were wagon trails. Americans had never really left them, he could tell, traveling back upstream, so to speak, and seeing how the Great Plains and all that lie behind to the west was just a convergence of ever-widening paths. Leaves of grass grew along the way, an easily recognizable landmark, as was Uncle Tom's cabin. For a period, though, the lay of the land grew more obscure. A raven flew up alongside the plane, croaked, "Nevermore," then careened back down, alighting on the head of a great white whale that had surfaced in Walden Pond. There's your line. Soon afterwards, wilderness closed in. From a hilltop, a lone Mohican waved goodbye, and Compy waved back with the plane's wings. Then he let out the choke a bit, and they climbed up, and over the Appalachian Mountains. The plane dipped as they bridged its crest, hitting a pocket of low pressure. When it regained its wings, they were lower and over a land where there was writing, but not literature. The trees here were dense as though there were no printing presses to swallow them yet, imported paper being used for religious pamphlets and tracts on how to succeed in business, the diet of nation makers, preachers, and other fanatic enough to relocate to a howling wilderness. To amuse E, Compy swooped low to buzz a prayer meeting. The number of holy rollers who had books to shake back at the plane made E wonder if he'd been wrong about the press, and if it had even already churned out the nation's first bestseller, the Bay Psalm Book. He doubted this, though, when he saw the cargo ships in the bay itself, ponderous from the weight of books, ideas, and other baggage brought here from the old world. Beyond, the open ocean. The first slave ships were driving toward their destiny just ahead of the Niña Pinta and Santa Maria. The strong wind that sped them on slowed the plane. It whipped up whitecaps that reminded E of the leaves of a book being rifled. They were the leaves of a book, an ocean of undulating pages, printer's ink, and white space poured together from the rivers of every nation on earth. Endlessly churning, it seemed as though the whole globe was a sea of words, a universe of words that stretched further than the mind could follow until hours later, a continent emerged, low on the horizon. The more distinct it became, the stronger grew E's sense of a converging significance. He hoped they were heading for Paris so he could see the origins of his serious work, but instead of cafe-goers, expatriates, or even campesinos, the land they reached was peopled by men so primitive he doubted they had yet achieved the cave painting. His pulse quickened all the more at this, for he began to believe that he was going to see not just the origin of his art, but of art. Suddenly there were great shoots of lava that darkened, and they were in a storm. The rain so thick it seemed like flying through a waterfall. And then they were out, and Campi turned his head and grinned and pointed, and there, ahead, all he could see, as white as a blank page and as white as all the world, great, high, and unbelievably bright in the sun, the square top of Kilimanjaro. And then he knew that that was where he was going. The medical machine made a high-pitched whine that sounded like the hyena. C stood dazzled by the whiteness of the room. Lights glaring, she had to squint to look through the plate glass that separated her from the machine E was being trolleyed into. His eyes were unseeing as they had been for the past 2 months, staring as if into eternity. Even plants turned to the sun, she knew, and she wondered if he could tell how bright and clean the room was around him. The night he slipped into the coma, she had asked the doctor, "Can he?" She had wanted to ask, "Can he hear us?" But emotion choked off her words and the doctor had finished for her. "Feel anything?" Then, like a schoolboy whose curiosity had been stirred, he added, "Let's see." He nodded to an intern making the rounds with him, who lifted an arm, stuck in a pin, then let the arm drop back to the mattress. So much dead meat. Less than a plant. Less than a sequoia that could live as silently as this for how long? It would be up to her to complete his story, she could see, but resurrecting him somehow, or even pulling the plug, had to be beyond the power of any one woman or discipline. So he'd remain this way indefinitely, a living corpse to be poked and examined by doctoral students, archivists, and the curious as she struggled with his ending. Yes, and hers, for surely it was up to her to shape their ending in the time she had left, before another, younger generation came to stand in her place while she lay where he was now. And who knew what horrors and pleasures desire and commerce would combine to invent by then? The machine made the same strange hyena noise, but she did not hear it for the beating of her heart. Thank you.